All right. Thou art worthy is our song for today. Thou art worthy, thou art worthy, thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, glory and honor, glory and honor and power. For thou hast created, hast all things created, thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are created, for thou art worthy, O Lord. Thou art worthy, thou art worthy, thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, glory and honor, glory and honor and power. For thou hast created, hast all things created, thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are created, for thou art worthy, O Lord. God, you are worthy. And we're so glad that we have a chance to meditate on you, to experience your presence, to read your word. And we ask that as we are gathered here together to honor you and give you praise and to learn and to grow, be with us, help us, guide us, and thank you for loving us. We pray in your name. Amen. Alrighty, how's everybody today?
Good.
Good?
So
Good. So far,
So far. It's early.
all right. Well, welcome you who are here in person, and it looks like we've got Debbie, Paula, and Joy that have checked in and said hello this morning. So hello to you. We are in step 4, and we left off last week talking about the shadow self. I'm just going to reread this part, and then we'll keep it going from here. So there is a paragraph starting with your shadow self, and let us take a look and see what this says. This is Breathing Underwater, Spirituality in the 12 Steps by Richard Rohr. Your shadow self is not your evil self. It's just the part of you that you do not want to see, your acceptable self by reason of nature, nurture, and choice. Your unacceptable self by reason of nature, nurture, and choice. That bit of chosen blindness, or what AA calls denial, is what allows us to do evil and cruel things. That's chosen blindness, a bit of chosen blindness, without recognizing them as evil and cruel. And so ongoing shadow boxing is absolutely necessary because we all have a well-denied shadow self. We all have that which we cannot see, will not see, dare not see. It would destroy our public and personal self-image. The more you are attached to any persona or stage mask, as it's called in Greek, whatsoever bad or good, any chosen and preferred self-image, the more shadow self you will have. So we absolutely need conflicts, relationship difficulties, moral failures, defeats to our grandiosity, even seeming enemies, or we will have no way to ever spot or track our shadow self. They are our necessary mirrors. All right, I better quit before there's too much to to take in. So this is looking at our shadow self. All right, a couple more people joining in. Good to see you. So the shadow self is not the evil self. That's probably one of the first and important things to remember. It just, when we think of our dark side or our shadow side, we might think, oh, that's my bad side. But it doesn't mean that. This is the part that we don't want to see. And it says here, there's a bit of chosen blindness. There's a bit of denial that goes into us not seeing it. All right? You've been warned this morning, so from now on, it's on the ball's in your court. All right? And we all have to, that has to be brought to light for all of us, and we need to be reminded of it as well. So we do have part of us that we don't accept. And so it's not evil, it's just that we don't want to accept it. And I would say normally this shadow is probably related to some type of pain in our life, related to some kind of shame, related to disappointment, some type of brokenness. Usually it's related to something that didn't go right or was not properly formed. So as soon as we recognize that there's part of us that we wouldn't want to show anybody, or that we, for our own preservation, maybe need to keep hidden, then that kind of turns into the shadow. And a lot of this is done kind of subconsciously, not necessarily do we consciously do this work. So it's not, this is something that we're probably not going to really recognize this concept until we're a little bit mature, until we can kind of understand the complexities of the human mind and self-perception and so on. So what Richard Rohr is saying is that because that exists, and all of us, as long as we're in this body of ours, as long as we're going on this journey that we're on in life, we're probably always going to have that in the background. And the goal is for us to bring the shadow into the light, and then to take the steps necessary to integrate the shadow into our lives. And so the good thing, the good news, is that there's probably some treasures to be found within the shadow. There's probably some tremendous benefits that the shadow has, but there's a whole lot of challenge around it. And so usually when we look at the shadow, we just see the challenging part, and we're not really looking at the gold. But if we can fully integrate this shadow part of us into ourselves, we can actually become a fuller person and a more free person, because it takes a lot of work to keep those things in the shadows, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. So Richard Rohr is saying here, we actually need these things in our life that we also avoid, which are the conflicts, the relationship difficulties, moral failures, defeats to our ego, even enemies. We actually need the challenge of that in life in order to bring the shadow into the light. Those things help us to see that. So if we're looking at our, this fourth step has to do with acknowledging our faults, acknowledging our shortcomings. So that's part of it. This is not really. Step 4 is not necessarily the step of uncovering your shadow, but step 4 is about finding the moral failures that will leave us clues to find the shadow itself. So, and usually, a lot of times what will happen is the shadow will manifest itself in our life as moral failure, or even sometimes things like perfectionism, when we're trying to be our best and we're trying to do good and we're trying to do right, sometimes what's behind that is the shadow part of us that is maybe dealt with rejection or dealt with dealt with rejection or dealt with being told that there's something wrong with us. And so often what we try to do, like with perfectionism, where we try to be perfect, is maybe we're trying to match up to some kind of standard that somebody told us we needed to be in order to really be a good person. We had to match up to this moral standard. And then sometimes it's not even like a moral person that tells us about this standard we need to live up to. It may be a person that has their life is a mess themselves, but they're simply telling us that we should act a certain way because it's bothering them or it's getting in the way of their life. That the whole thing of children should be seen but not heard. That's kind of an older way of dealing with children. So if that is taken as being like a value that a whole society embraces, that children should be seen, not heard, then there's probably a whole lot of children growing up in that environment that have this idea that their voice is not something worthwhile. Their needs are really not important compared to other people. And so that can end up becoming this shadow thing that we deal with. So, there's probably some people that if they grew up with that kind of idea, they may grow up to be adults that believe that they can be seen, but they shouldn't be heard. So maybe they work at really presenting themselves as something appealing to people around, but they just need to keep their mouths closed so that they don't spill the beans, that there's part of something inside of them that maybe everybody doesn't want to hear. And usually the things that people don't want to hear is not everybody's ready for us to share our vulnerabilities or to share our brokenness. This is one of the reasons why we kind of make this covenant agreement when we come together in groups, is that we have created an environment where we say to one another, this is a safe space, and this is a place where we all are going to be doing the work of trying to uncover this shadow, and in doing that, we're also going to be uncovering our moral shortcomings. So we kind of start with the shortcomings, and we say, like, I've noticed in my behavior that I do things that I know I really shouldn't do, and that might hurt myself or hurt other people. And as soon as we point that out, the next step would be for us to say, okay, why do we do this? Because oftentimes, like the Apostle Paul says, we really don't want to do the wrong thing. We really don't want to be bad people. We want to be good people. We want to be loved. We want to get along. We want to have friends. We want to be successful. We want to have purpose in life. Those are all things that everybody wants. Everybody wants a good, healthy life, until we kind of figure out how hard it's going to be to really have that whole full thing. We're going to have to look deep inside and acknowledge where our shortcomings are. And it's one thing to admit your faults. It's one thing to say, I screwed up, either out of ignorance or I really knew better or whatever. It's one thing to admit that, but the next step is kind of admitting our brokenness in relationship to that. So that's where the persona comes in. So acknowledging that there is such a thing as the shadow will help us in this path, because we're not admitting our faults so that we can be chastised or judged or told how to do the right thing, because that's just the cycle. If you don't address the shadow, you're just going to keep messing up in the same ways.
The thing about the shadow is, I believe it's in the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, shadow has no power within itself. Shadow is a shadow. It's there, and it only comes visible when you're in the light or being enlightened. And that's when we see it, we look at it, we take it for what it is or whatever it is. It doesn't scare you if you really, I don't know whether, but then we think of times that when we're in the dark or when we're in something and we see a shadow kind of go across something and we get frightened. Or we have an emotion that pops up because of that shadow.
So it's probably, a lot of it is probably just connected to the fear of the unknown. So a shadow is not, when you're looking at a shadow, you don't know what you're looking at, because you're not, like you said, you're not looking at the real thing.
No,
but
it's
you're
no
looking
power.
you're looking at the reality that there is something casting a shadow.
It's you.
So there's something to be afraid of. Yeah, it's you. You're the one that's casting the shadow. So, but even though it's not real, it's scary, and maybe that's a good reminder as we're doing shadow work. Is remember the only reality here is, let's look at it this way. I think in some ways we are afraid of the pain that we've undergone in life, to come to the realities of the pain and disappointments of our life, to come face to face with them, and to allow ourselves to feel them again, or to allow ourselves to integrate them and make them a part of who we are, because we don't know what that experience is going to be like. That's scary. So that's kind of the shadow, is the we don't know part. We don't know. What if I do admit that this is who I really am, and this is what my experience really has been? And I've experienced it in my own life, where if I think about it, there's probably certain chapters of life that I will more readily access, and I'll remember fondly and accept as this is who I am. So I look at a lot. I have a lot of wonderful childhood memories of playing, of family, of things like that, and I readily embrace those things. But then there's some other things that have happened in my life that have been, extremely disappointing and hurtful, and have made me angry. Not just in the moment, but like the type of anger that you carry with you.
Right. Well, obviously, you know all this yourself. I mean, who are you admitting it to? You know it, it's in your whatever you've done. You remember.
Well, if acknowledging it to yourself is one thing,
Yeah.
but there is something about admitting it to another person that
Well, what if
kind
you're a
of makes
thief? You're
it
not going to go to say to somebody, "I'm a thief." I mean, there's certain things you're not going to say to anybody ever.
right. But what happens is, if you do admit it to somebody, then it kind of becomes more real. It becomes more of a reality when we include somebody else. The goal of this is to have somebody that you share with, that you completely trust, that you can admit to. So, an example of this is, for forever the Catholic Church has had, I don't know forever, but for a large part of the history of the Catholic Church, they've had the confessional. And the idea is, this is somebody who you can trust, who can tell these things to, and it's just going to stay in the confessional.
And they
Now,
give you absolution for it.
there may be some that don't trust that and say, like, well, I know that priest is not going to keep his mouth shut, and they may not use the confessional. But for those who do, it becomes a safe place to unload these burdens. A therapist legally is supposed to be somebody that you can have 100% confidence in. They're not allowed to. Now, sometimes I thought about this as like, well, you see it in the movies where it's like, I don't know, there's some court order and they're required to turn over your records. It's like, oh, that's kind of the nightmare of. There is a scenario, trusted friends, but friends can betray. So this is the other tricky part, is that, yes, I think we can admit it to ourselves. I mean, we can say it out loud, we can write it on paper, we can do whatever we want because we probably trust ourselves more than other people. But there is something therapeutic and healing in sharing it with another person, as it kind of just grounds it in reality. It's almost like we can know something, but if we say it out loud, it becomes something else. And if we live it out.
There is no way I'm gonna tell anybody.
You never know. It depends on the circumstances in your life and what you're going through.
I have
Cut
had.
them or hurt them, I mean, physically.
I'll share with you. So in previous years of being a pastor, I have visited people who were in their final stages of life and have asked if I would come and talked with them because they wanted to share something. And I've had people share with me not something that they have done, but they've shared something that has been done to them, how they were abused as a person by somebody who absolutely should not have been abusive, somebody that should have been trustworthy. And so this poor person carried it with them all the way as long as they could. And there was, at least in the moment, there seemed to be a sense of relief and a sense of freedom that I finally have kind of unloaded this burden that I've carried with me. But it takes trust. Now, if you're going to wait until the last moments of your life, I don't know if you call that trust.
Ready?
Or you just want to make sure that you've crossed off, you've done everything you need to do before you move to the next phase. But trusting other people is very, very difficult. And what we might find is that we might find part of our shadow is a person who in the journey of life has discovered, I can't trust people. And so what ends up happening is that we've kind of integrated this into our shadow, where we will present ourselves to the world in a way that looks like we're engaging and so on, but there is a part where we're not being fully vulnerable and we're not fully, letting people know who we are and what we've done and the secrets that we have with us.
They're not saying that you would not have to confess it to the person you did it to or whatever it was you've done. It's another confidant.
Well, this is coming in some steps later in the 12 steps, is that we do have to discern, depending on what the circumstance is. Sometimes it would be helpful to you and to another person if you do confess something. On the other hand, sometimes if we confess something, it's not helpful to the other person. So I'll give you an example. If somebody has been an abuser, if they've been someone who has hurt innocent people and people who were powerless to do anything about it, an abuser who finally comes to realize what a crappy person they are and that they have hurt so many people, they're going to want forgiveness. But by them going to somebody that they've abused, they might actually hurt that person more. So it would actually be more moral and ethical for them to deal with that on their own with a therapist or something like that. So and a person who has done that might still need to be working through some shadow stuff, because there's a possibility that whatever it is within them that caused them to abuse other people might still be working itself out. So going to someone that they've abused before, they might end up unintentionally or intentionally, hurting that person again. So it takes discernment to know who should I tell, for what reason should I tell, can I trust this person to tell? And we have to ask ourselves, are we not being forthcoming because we really kind of want to keep this to ourselves? The persona is who we present to the world. So this doesn't mean that I'm not being authentic if I don't tell you everything that I've done in my life or everything that's been done to me in my life. That's not necessary. That's not helpful for me to just throw up all over everybody and bleed all over everybody. It's not helpful for relationships, and in some ways it can be more selfish.
Right.
You can have somebody that comes and like spills their guts on you, and it's like it's kind of a selfish move. It's not really thinking about the other person.
Like, it just depends on the situation. So this just happened like in the last 2 months. Like, I've had a lot of stuff happen in the past, and Brianna in the last, since like, okay, so she's had a lot of stuff happen to her in 2 years, well, over 2 years. Okay, she watched her mom and dad get divorced. Even though she knew her mom and dad weren't in a happy marriage, and she still was used to mom and dad being together, even though dad was always at work or golfing. That's what her life was. Then she sees mom and dad get divorced. Then she sees dad go date. She sees mom start dating. Then she sees mom sell the house that she's lived in since she was 1 year old. Dad move out, get his apartment, mom get a new place. Her dog dies. She's dealing with her crazy nana, my mom. High school. It's a lot.
Right.
So I noticed, she's got a lot of anger in her. She reminds me a lot of myself when I was her age. And, I said, so I had to tell her. I told her how I did drugs when I was younger. I told her I was raped when I was 18. I told her some more. I think she is old enough now. And I said, you cannot, I had a lot of anger in me, Brianna. I had a lot more crap happen to me than you, but everyone's situation is how they deal with it, right? And I'm like, you can't let it affect you. You have to talk about it. And so that was my situation with her. And I think it's helping,
Yeah.
So.
If we can learn healthy ways
And
to process
that's what I
along the
told her. I
way,
said, things will keep happening to you, Brianna, throughout your life. You gotta learn how to deal with it
Yeah.
in a healthy way.
Right.
That's exactly what I told her.
Right.
And I said it took me a long time, Brianna,
It-
to learn that. So
there-
I'm telling you now.
It's good. It's hard when you're in between being a child and an adult, which we all go through, because there's a dependency. You still are dependent as a child, but you're getting your independence. So there's going through that. There seem to be moments in life where we kind of start to realize how challenging life is. And for some people it starts really early in life, some people it happens a little bit later, but eventually everybody kind of figures out, there's some really hard parts of life, accepting not only life's challenges along the way, but then kind of like how life comes to an end, dealing with that. So learning the tools along the way will be very helpful later on in life. And like we're saying here, having people that we can trust to help process what we're going through is just it's a gift that if it can be used, the sooner and more often it can be used, the more beneficial it is. But the tricky part is that learning how to trust is sometimes very difficult, especially if we don't have that kind of in our programming from an early stage. If we didn't have anybody, if we grew up in situations where we didn't have anybody that we could trust, or found that the people that we should trust we couldn't, if we're in that place, then it's going to take a while to eventually learn how to do that and get the skills for that and be able to fully engage in that. So yeah, it's and these are what we want is for those things that you're describing, things that she didn't choose to happen to her in her life, and they're not consequences of the choices that she made, and so that's one of the things that we have to come to accept, is that there will be things in life that we don't choose that come to us, that we still have to take the responsibility of taking care of ourselves and processing this. And it's not fair that we have to do it. It's not fair because we didn't ask for it and we didn't make it happen. So it's not fair. And that's where a lot of times anger comes in, is that it's like, this is not fair. I didn't do anything. I was just doing my thing, and the world came crashing in on me. So that's like, in a way, that's what the story of Job is all about, is that, Job says, look, I'm just minding my own business. I'm being a good, responsible person, and then all this stuff happens to me. And so he has to deal with accepting that that's a part of life. Now, what this is telling us is that in some ways, in some miraculous ways, these things that we experience can be something that help us. However, when you're in the middle of the immediate pain of something happening to you, oftentimes this is not something that we're ready to do. It's like you can't, if the full impact of the painful event hasn't fully sunk in yet, if you're still in the middle of pain, you can't really go through the healing process, because it's almost like there was some book in a pastoral care class that talked about how we are wounded healers. So we're people that have experienced wounds, and we bring that wisdom and relationship to incorporate people into a healing process. But you can't be a bleeding healer. So if you're in the middle of bleeding, if you're in the middle of experiencing the first reality of the pain, if it hasn't kind of had some time to heal over, then that's really not the same as the shadow. The shadow is something that's going to come up later in life, based on what hasn't fully been integrated and healed. So that's when the shadow comes up. The shadow doesn't come up in the middle of the painful situation. So
I'm just thinking how wonderful. I grew up without a brother or a sister or a father. I just had my mother. And wouldn't it have been wonderful if I had a brother or a sister to talk to and share with? Wow, what I missed.
yeah,
Really?
Yeah. There's, I've heard people that grew up in families who kind of wish they had been the only child, because they feel like they got neglected or there was too much conflict or whatever. But I've heard the same. Yeah, I've heard the same from people who were the only child, that it was lonely. It would have been nice to to share with somebody the same way. So it's kind of a, every scenario has its pros and cons, but that can be somebody who did grow up with brothers and sisters, or grew up in a place where there were people their own age, and they kind of learned to share with one another. That may come more easily or second nature than if we've grown up around adults and been the only small person, because then there's really nobody that's our equal that can understand us and is sharing the experience. Yeah.
One of the parts I feel I found myself, as far as that goes, is your spiritual self. In other words, when I hit myself at that part of the thing there wasn't a person. I mean, I tried that route, where you go with, or make amends and you want to do other things, but where I found my best peace and where I found it was through spirit, through church, through the Holy Spirit, if you want to look at it like that. That became my confidant, and basically gave me the direction to go. And if you really ask it, it actually made you face yourself without burdening another individual with it. And Robert Schuller, if you remember Robert Schuller, Mr. Positive, he always I really like to say is, Reverend Robert Schuller, he said, turn your scars into stars. That's one of the things that's always stuck in my head. In other words, it's what he said. And honest to goodness, the worst things that have happened in my life, in other words, like there, I've come totally at peace with, and with anyone or anything that supposedly did me wrong, or I did them wrong, or whatever. I've come to peace with it, because it's a shadow as far as it goes. The shadow is that hidden part, it seems, is facing all those things within yourself that you don't really want to maybe discuss with another individual. And I find that the worst things in my life turned out to be some of the best blessings I've received, when you understand it and you see the reason behind it, and you see how you can avoid repeating those things even on a small basis. And I really believe that's with the church. I would come in here, a place like this, is to get ourselves in tune with that higher power within ourselves that deeps into our subconscious, that raises those things up, and that has that wonderful thing that is within each and every one of us.
Right.
We just gotta uncover it and take it out of the shadows, if you
Right.
want to put it that way, bring it into the light.
So there's power in this. We have the cross behind us. This is an ultimate. There's a truth in the cross and resurrection that can just continue to unfold in our lives and make a difference. And it is the message of the cross is along the lines of what you're talking about. I mentioned a Tony Robbins quote about your worst day can become your best day. And so if we think about the worst things that can happen to us, they're actually the best things that can happen to us. Now, in order for that to make sense, because that sounds crazy, as soon as it comes out of your mouth, that sounds crazy. But that's really what the message of the cross is about, is this, that it's okay to die to ourselves, and it's okay to give Jesus uses the phrase to take up your cross or deny yourself. So denying ourselves, and not in the sense of denial that we talked about earlier, but to give up ourselves. And so that would mean the things that we are proud of and the things that we do hold dear as being a part of our identity, those are things we're being asked to give up. Also, the things that we're ashamed of and the things that we are hurt about, those also we can give up. And sometimes some of those things are easier to give up than others. So sometimes it might be easier to give up my shame to God and say, God, can you take my shame? Can you help me integrate my shame? And so there's this motivation to, I know if I can give that up, then I don't have to carry it around with me anymore. And but then another part of us might say, but there's some things about me that I do like. Do I have to give those up too? So denying ourselves essentially means we're not really clinging to this idea of a mask or a persona or something that is more valuable than anything else. The idea is that if we're being at one with God and being in a fully loving, uniting relationship with God, means denying ourselves. There's something of this. There's a little bit of a taste of this in our own relationships, where if you decide to become a parent, then you deny a certain part of yourself for your children. If you're going to come into some type of a committed, long-term, loving relationship with another person, you'll find you have to give up part of yourself to be in that relationship. So that's almost like this. We get these little practice runs along the way, of what it means. We're motivated to do it out of love. We're okay to give up part of ourselves that we really like or that we really don't like in order for love. And so Jesus is just asking us, continue on that path until I have all of you, until you're not holding on to any more of you and you have completely given yourself over to God. And that's what the cross is about. And when we do that, that's when what is risen, the resurrected us, the new us, is kind of more like the real us with God fully in us. So that's kind of the message of the cross. And that's kind of like what we're talking about in step 4, is looking at what are some of the things that's like preventing me from just fully giving myself over to like the good that God has for me. All right, let's continue on here. So a little bit further, this is toward the end of one of these paragraphs. No one consciously does evil. The very fact that anyone can do stupid, cruel, and destructive things shows they are at that moment unconscious and unaware. Think of that. Evil proceeds from a lack of consciousness. Now that's, we have to chew on this a little bit. All right? And essentially what this is saying is that if I become fully aware of who I am, including my shadow, if I become willing to do that, a person who is willing to go through that process is not likely to do evil on purpose, to intentionally bring harm to oneself or to others. But if a person does it, it's because they're ignorant to something. So this makes me think of, we're back thinking of the cross in the week of Passion. One of the statements from the cross that Jesus makes is, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. So they think, I'm crucifying this Jewish criminal. I'm doing my job as a Roman soldier, and this is an extraordinarily bad guy who is a threat to Rome and to Judah. And so a person doing that might say, I'm doing my duty, I'm being a good soldier, I'm serving my country, I'm a responsible person, I'll even do the dirty work on behalf of my Roman citizens. So a person could feel justified in doing that. Jesus says, Father, forgive this person. They don't know the harm that they're causing. They don't see it. They're unconscious of it. So there are things that we might do in life. I think for the most part, when people do bad things intentionally, if you dig into who that person is, they are probably an unhealthy person with a lot of shadow and a lot of pain, and life has become so messed up that essentially they become psychotic and end up, hurting people, thinking that it's going to solve some problem for them, bring them a certain amount of joy. They have there's a lot of reasons why people think that they do bad things, but essentially what the author here is saying is that to have a full awareness of who we are, when we're trying to do that, we're not doing things consciously. So that makes the imperative for us to face who we are deep inside even more, because if we're refusing to uncover what's really deep inside, it can be hurtful to us and it can be hurtful to the people around us, and we may not even realize it. We may think the world is against us when in fact we're the ones causing all the pain and havoc all over the place. Step 4 is about creating a good and trustworthy lamp inside of us that reflects and reveals what is really there, knowing that anything exposed to the light, like you said, will itself become light. Somehow goodness is transferred by radiance, reflection, and resonance, and with another goodness, more than by any act of self-achievement. We do not pull ourselves up, we are pulled. God does not directly destroy evil the way our heroic, dualistic mind would like to imagine. God is much wiser and wastes nothing and includes everything. The God of the Bible is best known for transmuting and transforming our very evils into our own more perfect good. God uses our sins in our own favor. God brings us through failure from an unconsciousness to an ever deeper consciousness and conscience. How could that not be good news for just about everybody? Now that's a powerful statement to think that God, this is where this is from Romans. All things work together for good for those who love. So this is the idea that God is taking the good stuff, the bad stuff, taking all of this, and doesn't throw it away or burn it or get rid of it, but instead transforms it, turns it into something good. I mean, just look at nature. If you want something to really grow well in your garden, what do you put on top of it? You put crap on top of it, right? You put manure on top of it. You put the grossest, vile, the stuff that we want to get rid of, we actually use it because within the crap is where the nutrients are. And is where there's certain processes that will help to transform us. It's the same if you look closely. It is that death produces life. It's crazy. Think about how we eat. Whatever we eat, at some point, hopefully, was alive. At some point. Unless we're eating something artificial, which we do. But the natural things that we eat, there's enough natural stuff in what we eat that it keeps us going. Plants and animals, when we eat them, they die. If they're not already dead, we chew them up, they decompose, they turn into poo-poo, and our body takes out the energy and the nutrients, and then there's some leftover nutrients, and then it feeds life again. I mean, life's crazy like that. It's the only way that we stay alive is to eat dead stuff. That's really gross to think about. But even the stuff that we eat, if you go to your garden and you eat straight out of your garden, yeah, you're eating something alive, but guess what? It doesn't stay alive. So it's in this process of life that death brings life. The stuff of death is what's needed for the stuff of life. And so there's a principle here within us that is the shadow stuff, which is usually, that's the stuff we don't want to show people. This is the crap of our life, right? This is the stuff that we're keeping in the outhouse. This is the stuff that has to be brought into the light in order to be integrated into our life so that it can be better. So we're using that. All of that's really gross, and I'm really sorry. But we're talking about good and evil. Essentially, we're talking about life and death when we're talking about good and evil, right? It's the wages of sin is death. All right, there's this connection. So there's sinfulness and death, and then there's life and goodness. Those. But the way God works in the world is by integrating it in some way. And what happens when things get out of balance or when things go the wrong way, it's usually caused by some of the natural processes of life, and some of them are us trying to manipulate the natural processes of life.
That's not, death, I just believe, as far as that goes, Jesus proved that eternal life, when you really believe in this, in other words, and you wonder how things work out, there's that perfect thing, which is the law. The laws, the simple laws, law of cause and effect, law of, Bible really tells you, in other words, what you send out. In other words, you're going to experience. It's going to be your judgment is what you do. The negative things you do are the negative things that you're going to have done to yourself, so you realize that, and you'll just have to say, as it said in the Bible, in other words, if your right eye offend you, pluck it out. If such and there, you gotta. Basically, it's what it says: cut it out. That's how I look at it. I interpret it. It says you're doing something negative. In other words, or offensive. Simple answer: cut it out. And again, that's again the part of it right there.
Some of us are afraid there's not going to be any parts left for us to be around, because my eye is offending, my hand is offending, my leg is offending, my heart is offending, and my mind is offending.
There's one expression in the Bible: be transformed by the renewal of your mind.
Right.
And when you renew your mind, in other words, you got to bring it down to the basics, cut it right down, remove the ego. In other words, put it aside. You can't kill it, but you can put it aside. Stand in the corner for a while because I've got to deal with something. It sounds crazy, but you've got to eat a lot of crow at the time when you remove your ego. In other words, you're always the one that, in other words, because you're looking at the faults that you need to lay out and do it.
If you look at, we may ask ourselves, how can something good come of this? And then we'll have some example of maybe from our own lives or that we've seen close to us. How can something good come out of this? It may not be really, you may not understand. It may be a mystery to us. It may not be until much later that we can say, like Tony Robbins says, yes, my worst day is my best day. Because when he tells that story, and when that quote comes from a story where he talks about his dad leaving the family when he was a certain age, and how somebody came to the door offering charity for like a Thanksgiving meal or something, and he was refusing the charity, and shortly after that he left. So he looks back at that day where he kind of saw his dad kind of in the raw in those moments. Somebody who was angry, refusing charity, really stubborn, more concerned about him than his family. You know, they're bringing food for the family, not just for him. And he says, I don't accept charity, you know. So he's looking at this picture of his dad in his own mind, and then his dad ends up abandoning the family. It's not until later when he kind of has some awakenings as to who he is as a person and what has made him a better person, that he can look back at that and say, oh, that day was my best day. Now, I said this at the sermon, is like, I don't know that your worst day is ever fully transformed so that it becomes your best day. I don't know if it's kind of like these polar opposite things where it's like they actually are two in one. Because if it really was your worst day, probably still your worst day, but it can become also your best day if it ended up bringing some stuff to life that never could have been brought to life otherwise. And that's kind of like what his point is that there is something that was born from that never could have been born otherwise. So that's the part about God transforming things. If it weren't for this, we wouldn't have this. It does not mean that we get to the place where we, the Apostle Paul talks about sin and grace in this way, almost like the more sin there is, then grace abounds. And he goes on and says that he's like, that doesn't mean we should all go sin as much as we can so that we can get more grace in our life. It doesn't mean that we go and just ruin our lives so that some good stuff can come out of it. That's not really how it works. But it's just letting us know that the grace of God is within the mix to bring these good things into something better. So the fourth step is not complete in itself. We need more steps after it. But just admitting our faults and admitting our shortcomings, that in itself is a step, but it's not the complete package. We have to continue on with the steps in order to find out that. So we'll have a little teaser for next time. So chapter 5, we finished chapter 4. Yay! Getting into chapter 5, accountability is sustainability. So now step 5, we admit to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongdoing. So this is going to be Elaine's favorite step here. This is admitting wrongdoings to somebody else. So you were kind of ahead of the game in thinking about that. You know, do we need to? And I would say we need to exercise wisdom in doing this. Do we trust God? Do we trust ourselves? A lot of times we'll keep stuff in the shadows because we don't trust ourselves. We're like, I don't want to see what's in my shadow because I don't trust what I'm going to do if I see it. Or trusting another human being. So, I mean, this is you cannot have love without trust. And so if you want love in your life, you're going to have trust in your life. And the more complete love is, the more complete the trust would be. This is not on the other hand. In addition to that, there is wisdom in exercising how and when we disclose our shadow stuff to the people around us. Because it's not because we're hiding it and necessarily trying to control it, but what it means is we know that uncovering our shadow and admitting our faults is risky and can be a painful process in itself. It can be disappointing to take a real hard look at ourselves. So we need to make sure that the person or persons that we do share this with, it's going to be beneficial to them as well. You know, for example, if I've got real problems, it's probably not good for me to share those problems with my kids. because they're not in a position to understand it, to be helped to me. Just because somebody is a listening ear doesn't mean that it's going to be helpful. So we're actually admitting this to somebody that could understand it. That's why groups are getting together in groups of people that include people of wisdom and experience that have been there and are more trustworthy. So this is not just sharing with, walking down the street and meeting somebody. Hey, can I tell you something? One time I did this thing that I've never told anybody, but I'm going to tell you. This is.
So you're saying the biggest problem is finding somebody that you can trust?
That is, I think that's an important part of this step.
Where'd you go? What do you do?
Now, if you can't find anybody that you can trust, we have to ask ourselves: am I looking hard enough, or that's tricky.
Well, there's
Yeah.
one,
Yeah,
look at it.
this is where, like what Jay was saying, is that maybe if the first person that we trust is God, the next step would be, God, I trust you. Will you lead me to another person that I can trust? Will you open the doors for that?
Exactly.
And will you, when I meet that person, will you let me know let me know in my heart that I can confide in that person? I mean, I think maybe that's the starting point. And if we can start with God and say, and figure out if God, we can practice our trust with God. And we can.
We've already told God what was wrong or what you did or whatever.
Right.
But to find it like human
To ourselves
beings,
and another person, there's something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is reason for that, and we'll uncover why we say that. There's a reason that this is a part of the. If it was only admitting to God and moving on, then there's because a huge component in this is that it's the realization that fundamental to life is relationships. To fully live and enjoy this life that we have, relationship is the key component. We have within our DNA and within the cultures that we have created as human beings, in our history, we are a history of people of relationships. The people that didn't have relationships, their DNA is probably not, that didn't make it. If you know what I'm saying. So it's the people that have had relationships. So this is family, this is community, our tribe, our
What I'm
group.
trying to say to you is, why do you have to tell a human being if you've told God?
Yes, that is what we'll talk about next week. You're not going to be here next week.
gonna be here
Oh my
next
goodness. Okay, we'll record it so you can watch it later. And my guess is we're probably not going to get to all the answers in one session. We're probably going to stick on chapter 5 for a few. All right. Those of you that have joined online, thank you very much for joining. I see Debbie says she's going to join later. All right. Good to see you, Paula and Joy. Glad you've been here. Zyra and Maggie. Maggie says, when I address my shadow or behavior, I can also address the people, places, and things that led me to and maybe influenced my behavior. That's right. It's a fully understanding not only of ourselves, but of the environment around us. And then Diane joined in. Yes, Romans 8:28, all things work together for good, Maggie. That is the right, that's the right text.
In one of my meditations this morning, but I couldn't remember what the verse was. Yeah.
Romans 8:28.
Romans 8:28.
Yes. Send us out in the power of your Spirit, Lord.